Hello and welcome to the Stapley Restoration Part 6 video. In this series I'm restoring the Stapley, which is a 1970s wooden water ski racing boat. And in this video I'm putting a new deck on the boat. It's a plywood deck and it's going to involve cutting scarves between all the various different parts that make that up. I'm also making something called the bubble, which goes on top of the deck, and that's got a dashboard in the aft side of it which houses a glove box and some gauges. There's a laminated piece of mahogany that forms a coaming on the aft edge of that bubble, and that runs down the side of the boat in two little sort of cockpit trim type pieces. They're cut from tapered mahogany. So there's a fair bit of shaping, laminating, things like that to do to make up all those pieces. There's a glove box door to make, and that's got a small veneer that's curved around the outside of it just to edge it off nicely. So there's quite a bit of work in making all of those parts. There's a lot of shaping to do and various different methods of bending wood and joining plywood. So we're going to be doing traditional scarves on the lower parts of the deck and a stepped scarf on the bubble. So there's a nice neat line that runs down the middle of it. I'll show you how we do that. So let's get started on the video and I'll explain each of the processes to you. So the first thing to do is to start just rough cutting the plywood parts for the deck. This is pretty much the same way that I always do skins for boats, decks, sides, even the bottom, things like that. I tend to try and just grab hold of a sheet, clamp it on the boat however I can, get it roughly positioned. A couple of clamps will just hold it in position. And then you can just mark it from the inside. And you just want to be roughly in the right kind of ballpark. I tend to cut things sort of 50mm oversize really. And give plenty of room to trim back to. It's easy enough to trim stuff like this with a block plane or cut it with a jigsaw. So the foredeck is made up of two pieces of plywood. They've got a scarf down the centre line. I wanted to do that so that that glue joint is really nice and stable and it's not going to crack over time and affect the finish on the deck. A scarf joint just gives you so much more glue surface area compared to trying to edge glue two pieces of 6mm ply. Even if there is a batten underneath, it's better practice really to do a scarf on that joint. So I've got a little scarfing jig that I use for this, and it's basically a way of cutting down that edge with a circular saw just a little bit off 90 degrees. So the scarf joint just brings the saw up a little bit to incline the blade, and then you're able to cut a fine taper on that plywood. So I tend to just rough cut the taper with that saw to give me the correct angle on the plywood. A little bit high if anything, so that there's not too much of a feathered edge on the ply. And then I just take it down with a block plane and just slowly bring that material down until there's a fine feathered edge on the ply, and then it's good to go. So then it was a case of lining up the two plywood pieces. When you've got two scarves like that, you can kind of lose reference of where the two edges should meet as they overlap, and you can end up with one piece coming a bit high and then you end up with the faces at different levels. So the next process was just to level those out, and I just laid them on the CNC machine bed because it's nice and flat, and just used a straight edge across those two parts just to check that they weren't riding up high on top of each other. Next thing was then to glue the scarf joint together. So I wanted to glue this before it was on the boat so that the whole piece was just one uniform nice curve, and there wasn't any kind of stepping in the joint. So the first thing was just to wet out those edges with pure epoxy, because plywood wicks up quite a lot. You want to get some pure epoxy on that exposed edge first and let it soak into the wood, and then apply some thickened epoxy to the joint. So that's going to stop the effect of the plywood pulling the epoxy away from the joint, and leaves you with a dry joint. So basically the glue ends up soaking into the plywood and coming away from where you actually want it to be. So that's quite good practice if you've got an edge glue plywood. Then it was a case of just doing all the other pieces of ply that are making up the deck. And again, it's the same process. I just tend to put a sheet on the top of the boat, get on the underside of it and just mark them out with a pencil so I'm roughly in the right position. It's so easy to just rip pieces of plywood down and just trim them with a jigsaw, that you've only got to be in the ballpark initially. So then I'm just dry fitting the forward panel once the glue's set on the scarf joint. I tend to dry fit everything, to be honest, several times, maybe even 3 or 4 times, just take it off and on the boat to get things right and make sure that they're perfect before I start sticking stuff down. You can see I'm just using this little tool here, and that's just a simple little piece of plywood for transposing a line from the hull, which is underneath, sort of going around the overhanging plywood on the deck, and then just you've got a pencil there that's collinear to that line, so you can just use it for copying lines out and around a piece of plywood that's slightly oversized. Quite a handy thing to have that. Then I'm just marking out the position of all the deck beams and the deck battens on the top side of the plywood, so I know where all the screws have got to go. When you're skinning anything with plywood, whether it's a hull or a deck, you've got to be quite particular about the pattern in which you tighten those screws. If you just go all the way down one side, the plywood will want to kink up. So you've got to kind of work it down evenly, and you can see what I'm doing here is starting from the center line of the deck and slowly just working those out and along the shear line, just to make sure that plywood pulls down nice and evenly and forms an even curve without bubbles in it or parts that want to kind of pinch. So that depends a little bit on the shape of what you're doing. A deck's fairly easy because it's just a fairly even curve, but if you're doing the sides or the bottom of the boat where you've got twists and cups and things like that, it can get a little bit more complicated, a bit more tricky to find the right procedure. So you can see the scarf there on the aft quarter section of the deck. I even scarfed these joints as well because I didn't want any of these breaking open and affecting the finish further down the line. So everywhere there's a transition between plywood parts on this boat, there's a scarf which is cut at 8:1. So with a bit of luck, we shouldn't have any movement in that at any stage down the line. Then we're on to gluing it in place. So thickened epoxy over all the deck beams, all the battens. I tend to use colloidal silica for this just because it's a nice general purpose thickening agent, and West epoxy of course, which is my, my go-to epoxy every time. So we just apply that to everything, screw the deck down using some large washers just to pull the plywood in nice and tight. And then the following day, as soon as the epoxy is set, we just back those screws out. You want to do that nice and early before the epoxy sets up too hard, so you don't risk snapping screws off in the deck, because then you're into a lot more issues trying to get those out. Then we're on to starting the bubble. So this is the part that fits on top of the deck and houses the dashboard and creates a glove box on the passenger side. So I still had the parts of the old bubble and I just kind of laid them on the deck to roughly give me the shape to pattern. The first thing to do was to create a proper pattern to give me that forward edge and get a nice even curve. Something good to work to because the old bubble was a little bit damaged when it came off. So just glued some scraps of plywood together using Pt6, which is just a quick fast setting super glue. And just formed myself a nice little curve that I could use for marking out the plywood parts for putting that together. So again, these are just rough cut with a jigsaw, slightly oversized from what I needed. And then I'm scarfing the joint where the two of these meet. So the way that you do that is on the same jig, but all you do is reduce the depth of the blade on the circular saw so it doesn't cut right the way through the plywood. It kind of stops a little bit short, and where the bottom of the blade sits gives you that square edge to the bottom of the scarf basically. So you cut one piece with the reduced depth on the saw, and the other side you can actually cut a full taper on it and then just dress that edge in. So what I did was I cut right through one piece and then I just dressed that edge in with a block plane until it met perfectly at the correct height. So the same process again then for gluing. Only difference this time is that I'm just masking up the face side of the plywood boards because I don't want to get epoxy all over that veneer and have to clean it up and try and sand it back out. I want to keep them as clean looking as I can, so I just mask those up. And then the joint is just glued together with some weight put on top of it in the form of some big pieces of wood and a piece of polythene on the bottom side and the top side of that scarf, just to keep everything nice and clean, stop it from sticking to anything, and just makes it real easy to clean up once the weight's taken off. Then we're on to the dashboard. So I wanted the dashboard to be the same type of wood as the bubble, so used part of the offcut for that, and then just put it in place on the boat and scribed it in a few times just to get the curvature of the deck right. Shaped the top edge to give me a nice uniform arc to shape the bubble, because this is the main former that actually shapes the bubble as well. Then after that, it was on to marking all of this out for what's going to go on this dashboard. So one side you've got a set of gauges and the other side you've got a glove box. I wanted both of these to be exactly the same proportions so they look nice and even and matched really well. So basically what I did was I worked out the diameter of the largest gauge and the smallest gauge, and I positioned this kind of kidney shaped thing that sort of complemented the large gauge on the bigger side and the smaller gauge on the smaller side, with just a line transposed between the two of them. Once I had that positioned and all the gauges were nice and even within that space, I just copied that across to the glove box side, so the glove box would be the same shape as the piece around the gauges. Took a little bit of thinking about, but it got there in the end. So to find the diameter of all the parts of these gauges, I'm just using a set of calipers to get the outer diameter, and then a set of dividers, which is just half that measured diameter. Use to draw a little circle. Makes it quite nice and easy for me to know how those gauges are going to look once they're actually in there with the outer profile accounted for. So I wanted the glove box door and the gauge cluster to be cut from the same piece of wood as the dash, so it meant that the grain runs all the way through and it all flows nicely in the finished article. So I had to be quite careful about how I cut those out. I did that with a jigsaw, just following the line, and drilled 2 little holes just to start me off. But I had to be quite careful about following that because there's not much room for error in that section. Then it was just a case of kind of shaping those up so they look nice and even, get the correct gapping around the door and around the gauge cluster as well. So the gauge cluster is a tight fit, and then the glove box has got a little bit of a gapping around the outside of the door just to allow it to hinge open and closed nice and easily. So because those have got exposed plywood edges, they had to be covered with solid timber. I didn't want the exposed plywood to be around the outside of those, so I cut some really thin veneers, about 1/2 mil thick, and in order to get those to make the bend, they needed to be soaked in water. So they were just put in a bucket overnight, just in some cold water. That made them a lot more pliable, and they made the bends nice and easily. So I then strapped them around the outside of the gauge cluster and the glove box door, and then they're also on the inside of the openings on the dashboard as well. So I just formed them around each of those and left them to dry so that they would be held in their position. So once they're dry, they could be trimmed down to size and then just double checked for fitment. And once all was good, I could glue them in place. So again, I'm using this Pt6 glue here, which is like a fast setting super glue that's cured with an activator. The reason I use that on these veneers is that they are very difficult to clamp properly, because there's sort of continuously varying curves on them. I found the only way I could really get them to be seated properly in place was to hold them, you know, using about 3 or 4 different fingers and clamps at the same time. So I didn't want to do that for 12 hours whilst epoxy set up, so I used this fast setting glue in this instance. So then it's a case of gluing the dashboard in place. It's a very simple structure underneath there. It's just the dashboard with a triangular piece that runs down the taper of the bubble. So these were just patterned from the original parts because that was how the original boat was done. So then we're ready to start putting the bubble on. This took a bit of thinking to get the right curve in there. Although it's only 6mm plywood, it's actually quite a tight curve and there's a lot of pressure on that piece. So it had to be brought down nice and slowly. So I put these little clamping blocks around the outside and just screwed it down a little piece at a time in conjunction with some clamps down at the dashboard end. And this had to come off and on the structure several times to get it to fit nicely. Each time just trimming a little bit around the outside using that pattern that I made before with the plywood. So then once I was happy with the outer profile of the bubble, it needed to be cut to a taper so that where it comes down and meets the plywood deck, there's a nice glue surface area there for the epoxy. So I needed to sand a taper on the underside of the bubble top. And that's what you can see me doing there on the sanding machine. So I just canted the sanding machine back and I just ran the part around to taper its edge. A little bit similar to the scarfing process really, but obviously on a continual varying curve, so it couldn't be done with a scarfing jig. The whole thing was then glued in place with thickened epoxy, and again covering the top surface with masking tape just so that it wasn't going to get marked up with any epoxy. Keep it nice and clean because this is going to be a varnished finished part of the boat, so it's got to be nice and clean. Then we're on to doing the side runs. So these are the parts that I mentioned earlier that come down the side of the cockpit. They're tapered to the same angle as the edges of the bubble, and they're just cut from solid mahogany. So all I did with that was I just angled the bed on the bandsaw to the correct angle, similar to the way that I did the spray rails in the hull repairs video, if you wanted to drop back and have a look at that. These were then run through the sander, so because they're a tapered piece, obviously they don't go through the sander particularly well. So all I did was I just put the two tapered pieces back together and then ran them through the sander, and I could face the cut edge. Then it was just a case of cutting those in so that they meet the edge of the bubble nicely. So that was a little bit of trimming by hand, just with the Japanese hand saw. So I basically just cut a nice square edge on the aft curve of the bubble and then matched that with the tapered piece of mahogany until the two met nicely, and then we had a good fit. The aft sections of these side runs just come down to a point as well, so I just copied that. That was on the original boat. This was all painted plywood before, so it's going to be varnished mahogany now on the finished boat, which should look really nice. And where they meet up to the bubble, they just taper in slightly, so they're tapered in one direction, but then they also curve in to meet the start of the curvature of the bubble. So there's quite a bit of shaping going on with those pieces. Took a little while to get those all nicely meeting up and flowing, but it looks really nice now, I think. So then I'm on to the lamination, which forms the coaming on the aft side of the bubble, which I mentioned at the start of the video. This is constructed of 3 8mm square section laminations which formed on the top side of the back of the bubble. The reason that these were square sections is because they've got edge set and spring in them, so they're curving in 2 directions at the same time, and I needed to be able to form that curve nicely. So the 8mm square section just worked perfectly for that. So I started off with just one section, gluing that on first, letting the epoxy set up on that. Then I glued the second lamination on top of that afterwards, and I ended up building that 3 high. Once that was dried and shaped, I then had something that I could clamp to sandwich that from either side. So that's then sandwiched from the back side with a single piece of shaped mahogany, which is done in 3 sections around the coaming. And then the forward face is also sandwiched as well. So we've basically got a square cross section that's built up of 3 pieces in the middle, and then an aft face and a forward face. So it will look almost like one continually flowing coaming when it's finished, but actually getting that shape formed took quite a bit of construction. It took me a little while to work out the best way to do that, and in the end I just kind of started cutting pieces and clamping them on and just getting somewhere about right. As you can see in the video, it took a little bit of back and forth, lots of shaping, lots of trimming, but it was something that I thought was going to really nicely finish off the back edge of that bubble and form a nice coaming that just wraps around the cockpit. It's quite a nice little feature to the boat. Similar kind of process to the cockpit coaming that I did on Missile. If you saw the old video on that, where I formed a single piece lamination that went all the way around the cockpit, I wanted a similar sort of process. This isn't quite the same as that, but yeah, I think it's a nice little feature just to edge off cockpits. So one thing I didn't particularly like about the original boat was the fact that this coaming sort of came down and finished a bit abruptly. I don't really like sort of sharp junctions in the lines of boats, so I wanted to just sweep that shape round a little bit further to join these side sections that come down the cockpit. In order to do that, I'm just making some little fillets basically. So they're just shaped pieces of wood that follow that line on round and just help it to sweep back into those cockpit sides a bit more smoothly. So they were just shaped and glued in place. And then it was a case of rounding all this coaming off with a router just to give me a nice soft edged feel to everything. Carving in the edges of the coaming so they come down to meet the deck line, and then just rounding everything off. Most of that was done by hand, to be honest, because it was kind of had to get a chisel in there to just get the right angles and get everything finished up just how I wanted it. So the final thing was to get the door and the gauge cluster fitted in the dashboard. So I had some really tiny little hinges to cut in there. It's just 2 little butt hinges on the lower side of the door. They were just cut in using a marking knife and a chisel. And I was pretty much just cutting through the thickness of the veneer that I put around the outside of that door. So not very much material at all, but it just helped to position the door perfectly within that sort of kidney shape. And it was quite critical on height for that, because you really notice if it's a little bit off one way or another. So then I drilled the holes for the gauge cluster, just did these slightly undersized with the closest hole saw I had, and then brought them out on the bobbin sander to get them just the right size for a good fit of the gauges. And this panel is going to be screwed in place, so as I said, this is going to be a tight fit on the gauge cluster with 2 little vertical plywood pieces that just support the back of it and screw it in place. And then the door is hinged with a catch on it. Lovely. So there we go, that's the Stapley Restoration Part 6 video. A slightly new format to this video from the way I've done things before. Hope you like it. Let me know in the comments below what you think, and if you're new to the channel, please remember to subscribe to keep up to date with what else I've been doing. So cheers guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.